So thank you for taking your seats, and welcome back to this second session, which provides an overview and a whole series of rapid presentations of relevant business impact work carried out under the Valuing Nature programme. So this session aims to champion that business relevant work done under the VNP. It's worth bearing in mind that this business relevant work under the Valuing Nature programme has been somewhat retrofitted to a programme following the launch of the programme, the announcement of opportunity. And indeed, Valuing Nature programme itself was largely designed in consultation with academia, not really co-created with business in the way that we're now seeking to co-create this new natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Nevertheless, a considerable body of business relevant work has taken place under the Valuing Nature programme, and this holds important lessons really for any future research and innovation investment. So the presentations of this session will reflect on the full range of business relevant work done under the Valuing Nature programme, present a number of examples of that work. And first and foremost, perhaps, to mention is that we put in place from the outset a business interest group involving 20 to 25 business representatives. Peter Young, who chaired this group, will provide an overview of the contribution it's made over the 5 years of the programme in advising on business relevant work. Secondly, we have been running a business impact brokering programme providing tailored support to the funded health and wellbeing and tipping point projects, including scoping of relevance of research outputs from those projects to business, and helping to broker engagement with business around the more promising business relevant opportunities. And this work is ongoing, and we'll hear of some of the business relevant outcomes from a couple of these funded projects. Thirdly, the programme has run a series of business impact schools, 3 of these, 2 in London, 1 in Edinburgh, which have brought together over 60 early career researchers with business representatives to enhance mutual understanding of valuing nature research and innovation for business impact. And many of our school alumni have gone on to expand their work with business. Some have even moved into the private sector to take forward R&D within business. So we'll hear from 3 of these alumni on how attending a business impact school has influenced their work and their careers. Fourthly, a number of Valuing Nature placements have been hosted by business or by organisations working with business, and we'll hear from one of these placements. Fifth, we, under the programme, have produced a number of business relevant natural capital synthesis reports, and we'll hear from authors of 3 of these papers. The programme has also produced a number of business relevant demystifying papers, which serve to explain key concepts to non-experts. And Eche, who has led these papers, many of these papers, will provide a brief overview of some of those. The programme has covered out other business relevant work that we don't have time to present today. This includes an important paper which has reviewed land allocation models, state of play on those, and is of particular relevance, of course, to those businesses that own and manage land. A report more focused on the global agenda, the report Joining the Dots, Global Challenges in the Valuing Nature Agenda, which looked at the state of play of collaborative research between the UK and developing country institutions, and that included also analysis of business relevance of that research. And there have been at Valuing Nature's annual conferences a number of business relevant sessions, for example, on finance for nature at the 2019 conference and on investing in natural capital at the 2018 conference. It's worth recalling also that business relevant work was carried out under the precursor Valuing Nature Network 2011 to 2013, including the work that I was involved in support of Ian Cheshire and his team on the Ecosystem Markets Task Force. So that's just a brief overview of what we're going to go through on this session, and I'll now hand over to Peter Young as Chair of the Business Interest Group to provide an overview of its contribution over the last 5 years. Peter.
Thank you. I'm actually mic'd up, so I don't even need to get to as far as the podium, but I'm going to retrieve the pen I dropped first. Okay, yeah, so I'll just stand here because I've still got mic'd up, so I don't need to stand at the podium, get a bit more variety. So, yeah, the Business Interest Group, I mean, I think the first thing I'd like to say is I'm enormously grateful to the businesses who joined up from the start, because it was largely an act of faith, to be honest, but it was an indicator of the importance that this subject area had, that people were willing to come forward. And it was quite challenging at the start as well, because business needs had to be retrofitted to some extent to the research projects already chosen. And I think many of the businesses that came along, including me as chairing it, thought perhaps it was a little bit earlier in the process. But over time, it became transformational in the outputs from these projects. And I think it was transformational as well for those working on them. We had a really a good mix. And absolutely key was starting off with a cross-sector involvement. There was no dominant sector. We had water, we had insurance, we had infrastructure, consumer goods, we had retail, transport, technology, land managers, facility managers, waste and resource managers, a whole range of companies that were represented. And yet, we could have a really fruitful discussion as a group about how we could contribute and add value to this programme, and how we could actually get much better coordination between the needs of business and the way in which the researchers developed. By reaching a sort of early agreement on the common benefits, we were able to develop a lot of those themes that Guy mentioned. And I particularly want to highlight the business impact scores, the business impact brokering, the business impact reporting, and the demystifying reports, because I think all of those actually were pretty innovative. I don't think any of those would necessarily have happened if we hadn't have had a business interest group who were challenging and asking whether or not these kind of outputs, which would be much more usable and accessible to the business community, could be made part of the programme. I mean, yes, we had business placements, we had conferences, we had a very good website dissemination process, and I think those are all good things, but probably that's more normal for these kind of research programmes, whereas the earlier things that I mentioned were not. And I think the other thing I'd like to say that was really important about the business interest group is we were able to keep, I think, good connection, but not at a too burdensome level, you know. And it's interesting that even without that huge commitment, meeting annually, some sort of dialogue in between, some events when people are involved, and then a really good contribution from business in terms of the other activities, particularly, I mean, the business impact scores could not have taken place if it hadn't had the time given. Now, it's interesting, if you get your sort of accountant's hat on, the actual process of the business interest group and the things that flowed out of it represented hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of effort actually by business, although most of it was more in time and in hosting meetings in kind rather than actually in finance, but a very substantial additional value unlocked for the programme. And something I think is quite important to be able to make tangible. And I think that raises one question going forward. When you're actually collaborating in this way, it's important that everybody's contribution is properly valued. We're talking about the challenge of valuing nature, but actually there's a challenge in actually valuing research contribution too. And I think it's important we get an even playing field for that. But I don't want to spend up a lot of time on this. There's a lot of stuff on the website. You can read these outputs. You can see how we operated. For me, the single highlight, and we're going to hear next, I think, from some of the individuals who are involved, was reaching over 60 early-stage researchers through the business impact schools. When we sort of advertised the first, we were overwhelmed with interest. It actually resulted in people coming forward who were working on existing PhD or postdoctorate research, which we weren't even aware of in the programme, which was highly relevant. And the willingness to engage from both sides brought real benefits to all parties in terms of the communication and the collaborations that then resulted. And in a way, that sort of leads in, I think, back to Guy for this sort of this session, which is actually to give you a feel for how that collective impact was felt throughout the programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we'll now then go into this series of rapid presentations, examples of business relevant work under the programme. We've allowed a maximum of 5 minutes for each of our presenters, so quite a challenge. Bill here will be holding up red cards, or yellow cards, or whatever, white cards, to allow people to know they've got a minute left, and we'll be keeping people quite strictly to time. First up, we've got Mark Reed, who actually is not here in the room, but he's prepared a video for us, which we'll now show. So Mark Reed from Newcastle University. The advantage of not having him in the room is he'll definitely keeps time. So Mark led one of the tipping point projects, and he's going to give us his take on business relevant output from this project. So if our technicians could kindly load the video, thank you.
Hello, my name is Mark Reed and I'm a Professor of Socio-Technical Innovation at Newcastle University and Principal Investigator of the Peatland Tipping Points project that has sought to understand how peatlands around the UK might respond to climate change and changes in policy and how we manage these environments that might lead to abrupt and potentially irreversible changes or tipping points in the services that we as society get from these environments. Our most important carbon stores under our feet is in peat bogs, not in our trees. In the UK, they're important for water quality, for flood risk alleviation, biodiversity, etc. But the problem is that the majority of them have been degraded in various ways, whether that be through wildfire or through drainage. And as a result, that is a cost to society. Fixing that problem is both important and expensive. It's important because peat bogs are part of the land use sector, which is a problem in terms of the UK meeting its Paris Agreement commitments to reduce our emissions to net zero. And it's expensive because many of these environments are really quite remote. So to raise our game to that challenge, we've been looking at how we might blend public and private finance using the Peatland Code that enables private investors to invest in peatland restoration for the climate and other benefits that you get. Now, the Peatland Code sat alongside the Woodland Carbon Code, our other regional carbon market in the UK, and something called Landscape Enterprise Networks in DEFRA's 25-year environment plan. And as a team, we've been looking at how we might be able to integrate these three private ecosystem service markets. Now, landscape enterprise networks work quite differently to these two regional carbon markets. They were developed originally by 3Keel with Nestle, although this is an open source mechanism, and there are a number of these now across the UK that don't involve Nestle. What we're trying to do now is to integrate mitigation of climate change and a bunch of other environmental benefits on farm through on-farm interventions with woodland planting and with peatland restoration now at a landscape scale. Landscape enterprise networks also pool investment, looking at a range of corporations, businesses that have dependencies on natural capital across a landscape, and then to pool that investment so we get over the free rider problem where people say, well, why would I invest when my competitors will benefit from them? And it's surprising the level of investment that this is attracting and the level of interest that we're getting in this as an approach now across the UK. What for me is really exciting about this is that this is moving out of the box of corporate social responsibility or CSR and into a box which is all about reducing risk. So the majority of these companies have a variety of climate-related risks on their risk register and are thinking about creative ways in which they might be able to reduce those risks, whether those be risks to their assets or to their supply chains, etc. And so what we're offering through these integrated landscape scale projects are a range of different interventions that might reduce those risks. And at the same time get a win for the landowners, the farmers, because they've now diversified their income to be able to get money for ecosystem services alongside the commodities that they might traditionally sell. And of course there is the benefit for the environment as well. we now have more resilient landscapes that are more able to adapt to some of the threats from climate change, whilst actually tackling the underpinning problem by creating landscapes that are absorbing carbon where possible and certainly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And as a result of those interventions now, we have these more resilient, sustainable landscapes that are providing benefits not only to the people who live and work on them and the companies who are investing, but to society as well. So a triple win for business, for landowners and farmers, and for the environment. Let's think more holistically, if we can, about what role business might play in the future of climate mitigation across the UK in the land use sector.
So many thanks to Mark for putting that together. So that was an example from one of the tipping point projects, and focused around peatland tipping points and the opportunities there to create business investment in restoration of peatlands. We'll move on to one of the health and wellbeing projects. Jack Benton of Manchester University will explain to us some of the business relevant output under GEAR. So over to you, Jack.
Okay. So it's very difficult to quantify the benefits that nature can offer for human well-being in a robust yet inexpensive way using the existing measures that we currently have available. Therefore, there's a lack of evidence around which nature-based interventions offer the best value for improving human well-being. To address this issue, we've developed Mohawk, a robust yet inexpensive tool that can quantify the potential benefits that nature might offer for human well-being by using direct observations of people's behaviour. We developed this tool based on the 5 ways to well-being, which are 5 evidence-based behaviours that are known to be important for improving our well-being. And we found that we can actually reliably observe 3 of these 5 behaviours, which are measured using our Mohawk observation tool. So number 1, be active, so physical activity behaviour. Number 2, connect behaviours, so social interactions. And number 3, take notice behaviour, so people consciously appreciating the environment around them. The Mohawk also assesses people's characteristics, including gender, age and ethnicity. So what we get from the Mohawk is quite simply counts of people, counts of these 3 wellbeing behaviours and counts of people's characteristics. So the picture seems to be cut off a bit there, but to demonstrate how we've been using the Mohawk, I'm just going to talk about one case study where we've been working with businesses like Peel Land and Property to try and demonstrate the potential wellbeing impact of nature-based interventions by using the Mohawk. So in this case study with Peel, we have evaluated and used the Mohawk along one of their canals in Salford, where they made several green space improvements. So we used Mohawk to collect data at this site at baseline before the improvements were made, which you can't see on this slide. And then we collected Mohawk data at 3 separate follow-ups after the improvements were made. And we also collected Mohawk data at 2 separate canal sites in Bolton and Wigan, which acted as sort of comparison or control sites because there were no improvements that were happening at those 2 sites. And what we can see here is just one of several outputs that Mohawk can offer. So in this graph, we simply see just the average observed number of people that were observed using these 3 canal sites at baseline, and then again at each of the 3 follow-ups. So what we can see is that at the 2 control sites where no improvements were made, we see that canal usage stays relatively stable over time, whereas at the intervention site where the improvements happened, we see quite a big increase in canal usage after the improvements were implemented. And we saw similar increases for each of the 3 wellbeing behaviours as well. So this case study therefore demonstrates how Mohawk can provide quite an easy way to sort of quantify the positive wellbeing impacts of nature-based interventions on the local community. So why should people be interested in using Mohawk? Well, we've just seen how Mohawk can demonstrate the social value of nature in a way that is relatively easy to understand. So it's likely to be relevant for investors and developers like Peel to sort of local and regional government authorities. Mohawk is also relatively inexpensive to deploy and relatively inexpensive to deploy consistently over time as well. Mohawk is user-friendly, given that we're only counting people and counting people's behaviour, so most people would be able to use this tool, and therefore we can get sort of lay people or practitioners, for instance, to use this tool with even as little as a day's training. Mohawk is unobtrusive, given that we're not interfering with people who are using the urban environment, so we're not relying on people to actively respond to surveys or input data into an app, for instance. Mohawk is reliable and valid. This has been shown in over 600 hours of data across 34 different sites. And Mohawk has not only been used along canals, but it's been used in pocket parks, in town squares, along tree-lined residential streets. And therefore, there's no reason why it can't be used in a wide variety of urban environments. So we're hoping that Mohawk is offering a robust and inexpensive method for generating wellbeing impact evidence in relation to the urban environments. If you are interested in potentially using Mohawk, please do get in touch or come and have a chat with me today. I also just finally wanted to finish up on some free mapping tools that the Gaia project has also produced. So if you are interested in learning a bit more about these mapping tools, please do go on the website, or I'm sure there'll be a couple of representatives from the Gaia project next door at one of the tables. But thank you for your time.
Many thanks, Jack. And of course, government has very significant house building targets over the next over the term of this government, and that's a tool that perhaps will be of very much interest to Ministry of Housing, who we've spoken to over the last few weeks about their interest in ensuring that natural asset issues are integrated into that house building effort. Okay, next up we have our alumni from our business impact schools, and first up is Prue, Addison, who many of you I'm sure will know, now at BBOUT, but previously or still perhaps linked to University of Oxford, and done a lot of work with the business community. So over to you, Prue.
Okay. Hi everyone. As Guy said, I'm Prue Addison and I work at the Wildlife Trust, and I'm a research associate at the University of Oxford. And so in 2016 I attended the first Valuing Nature Business Impact School. And these pictures, I took both of these pictures during my time at the Business Impact School, and it really highlights the contrasting venues that the organisers arranged for us, from the heart of London City at Willis Towers Watson out to the green open spaces of Windsor Great Park. And so back then, when I attended the Business Impact School, I was an optimistic early career researcher, conservation scientist, assuming that, like me, surely all businesses are doing good things for the environment just because they're intrinsically motivated to do so, because it's the right thing to do. Well, I was wrong. The Business Impact School helped me realise really quickly the many and varied motivations for businesses to value nature and to integrate that into their decisions. So from operational motivations to improve their operational efficiencies, financial incentives because lenders are telling businesses, you must do this, you must do good things for the environment, for legal and regulatory requirements, for brand differentiation, reputational management, and also just because shareholders or board members say so. Now, of course, this audience, you all know this. You know these many and varied motivations, but I can assure you most scientists don't realise this. And understanding why businesses are motivated and what they want to do in regards to valuing nature and integrating the environment into their decision-making is critical for scientists to understand. And so this was my biggest learning from the school. And so since then, I've made it my business to learn the language of business, to be able to communicate with them, build trust, identify opportunities for collaboration, and to identify opportunities to influence them. And so since then, I've had a keener eye on the opportunities to achieve research impact with businesses. So in 2016, when I attended the Business Impact School, I also started my NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellowship at the University of Oxford. And I planned at that time to work with a couple of businesses to develop biodiversity metrics for business. In the end, I worked with an ecosystem of collaborators with the intention of undertaking applied and relevant research that would influence businesses and help them account for biodiversity in their business decisions. So in the end, I, as a conservation scientist, worked with chartered and academic accountants, NGOs in business and biodiversity programs, government agencies, and some businesses as well. So what I learnt from my 3-year fellowship then was that to achieve real research impact, we really obviously need to work across disciplines and to address the challenges that businesses are wanting to work on. This is not about what researchers are interested in. This is about helping on the really applied side of research. And so this research is really applied, and I think it is actually really difficult to keep it within universities. And there are many people like me that often end up falling out of academia and into the real world to be able to keep on doing the work that we do. So now I work with the Wildlife Trust, and I now lead a large team, and we're developing on-the-ground conservation programs in and around Oxford. And so I think that there is a really big role for NGOs in this space of valuing nature and working with businesses. And so at the Wildlife Trust, I'm getting to work on some really cool, innovative practice now around sustainable finance and around how we upscale public and private finance to actually invest in natural capital in the UK. So I'm now keen, working on the outside, to bridge the gap back to academic research to actually help draw out really super applied research that can help progress the whole field and ultimately help environmental accountability for businesses.
Very many thanks, Prue, and we need a lot more people like you oiling the wheels. Next up is Eleanor too, who's now with the Forestry Commission, which I think in many respects we can count as a business. And Ellie also was at our first school in 2016. Ellie.
Yes, good morning. So I also attended the Business Impact School with Prue in 2016 during the first year of my PhD. And since then, I've now completed my PhD, and I'm working for Forestry England, which is the land management branch of Forestry Commission. I'm managing their forest resilience programme, and I'm also now an academic visitor at University of Cambridge. So the Business Impact School was a couple of really exciting and thought-provoking days, the type of experience that I have never before nor since experienced within the academic research world. Our cohort was mainly PhD students and some postdocs. We were expected to dress in business attire and attend meetings in a skyscraper in central London. We heard from organisations like Nestlé and the National Grid about how they're incorporating valuing nature concepts into their business. And we discussed how we could make our own research much more impactful and applicable to the business community, and we had training from experts. So there are a number of lessons and impressions that stayed with me from that school, which influenced my subsequent research and career choices. My PhD evaluated ecosystem service delivery from UK forestry, and I was a case student with Forestry England as my research partner. So like many conservation scientists, I've been motivated by the intrinsic value of nature, but I knew that to maximize the value of my research, I really wanted to understand how I could communicate it to Forestry England, my partner in business and economic terms. Now, as a young researcher, my lack of experience of the business world made it seem like this really intimidating and impenetrable place. So the first and most valuable lesson that I learned was that business really isn't so scary after all, and it's mostly just about talking a different language. And that important lesson that I learned then has really helped me, and I've since grown hugely in confidence in having those discussions. So now in my current role, I can hold my own in discussions about supply chains or income revenue, and I understand how to argue the case for nature much more effectively. So, as I mentioned, we heard from a variety of different organisations about how they're integrating valuing nature concepts into business. And I remember that some of those organisations were distinctly more impressive than others. So some of them really got it, but others were simply tagging it on in what seemed like an afterthought. And clearly misunderstanding of natural capital concepts is common. And although many organisations recognise it and they want to do something about it, they often don't know how to implement it effectively. That really helped me to focus my PhD by using science to generate practical business and land use recommendations. And it also encouraged me, like Prue, to look outside of academia for a career in a role that allows me to use my scientific expertise to help integrate the value of nature into everyday business decisions. And finally, I made a brilliant network of friends and colleagues, and I've bumped into the people I met on that business impact school so much more than people I've met at any other kind of conference or event. And whenever I see their name attributed to a piece of work, I always know that it's going to be interesting. And I think that that's a great credit to the organisers and the selectors of the school. So finally, we've been asked to briefly reflect on our own ideas for next steps for the research and innovation community. And in the time available, I'm just going to offer one suggestion, which has some clear synergies with what we've already been discussing this morning. So clearly, many organisations want to integrate natural capital concepts into decisions, but the decision support tools are, in my experience, simultaneously too complex and too simple. They're often far too complicated in that you need to put highly specialised data in a highly detailed way, often with some kind of degree in coding to help you. But at the other end, the outputs are often far too simplistic. So, for example, most models might return you a value for a generic woodland category, but they'll fail to distinguish between conifers and broadleaves, let alone any kind of further species. Land managers need the tools that's going to help them to make much more tailored decisions. So, for example, what tree species should we be using in all this new tree planting that's going to be going on? So we need to find that Goldilocks of decision support tools that's easy to use, but gives sophisticated outputs. So good luck. But thank you for listening. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Guy and the rest of the organisers of that Business Impact School. It was a brilliant experience. Thank you.
Thank you for the compliments, Ellie, and it's very diplomatic of you not to mention which companies it were that are impressive and which were less impressive at the Impact School. Okay, next we have Gemma, James, also at the first school, and now running Building with Nature. Gemma.
Hello, everyone. I'm Gemma Jerome, Dr. Gemma Jerome now. How exciting. So I attended the Business Impact School in 2016, and in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to give a very brief overview of the impact of attending that school and the resultant engagement I had with the business community and how that shaped my career choices. And then finally, I'm going to give some reflections on how decision-making and research and innovation can help businesses integrate natural assets into their business models. Okay. So in 2015, I was employed by a charitable organisation, Wildlife Trust, and I was employed also by the University West of England, and that was as a researcher. So the intention was to bring my knowledge and research experience to help innovate a new product to meet an identified market need. In 2020, now, I'm the director of a new national organisation which manages the delivery of this innovation, this new product, and I'm in charge of continuing to innovate that product and make sure that we continue to meet the market need. So that's the journey I've been on in the last 4 years. In terms of what the impact of the Value in Nature Programme Business School was, it really helped me to stress the importance of engagement with the business community. So as a researcher, you can often sit in your legendary ivory tower and just create solutions, not in a vacuum, but without that real kind of cut and thrust of what's actually happening on the ground. So the experience of the school really helped to highlight the role that keeping that engagement with the end user can play to ensure that research really meets the needs of the end user, of any products and services that arise from new research findings and insight. So essentially, that helped to shape the next couple of years of my role within this organisation to develop a product. So we started customer requirements testing at the beginning, rather than developing something in isolation and in a lab, essentially, and then bringing it out. Stakeholder engagement was an incredibly important part of the product innovation process. And I wanted to stress this important aspect of active listening. And if you want your product to be designed in a way that then it's actually going to meet the needs of your end user, it really is that two-way knowledge exchange between you as the researcher, you don't know everything, and the people who you're hoping will use the product you're developing. In terms of how it impacted on my career choices, I think this is a critical insight for me from the business school. Whereas once I may have stayed in research and became a member of a higher education institution, I was actually offered a full-time lecturer post, and my PhD supervisor was absolutely gobsmacked when I told him I turned it down. But that's the holy grail, what do you mean? I now understand the potential impact of bringing an inquisitive and questioning mind to a business setting, and how the results and impact of that mindset can play an incredibly important role in actually changing the world, which is why most people go into research in the first place. So in terms of my career choices, I think it's important insight for me to share with you that what the school helped me understand is you can have knowledge, but it's useless if you can't effectively communicate it. I know there are really, really good people in the research and knowledge education sector who can do that, but it's just as important when you're somebody with research skill set working in business. And then in terms of skills and training, you really need to target your skills and training to your customer, and that can really result in change and influence in the market. In terms of these photos, just really quickly, so the top one is me delivering some training to stakeholders from planning and development sector in Cornwall. So just showing how much you can really have fun with bringing new ideas through. You can make that often scary process into something that's actually a fun process. And the second one is the first cohort of approved assessors that I trained up to be the delivery agents of the benchmark that we actually created. And it's about developing high quality green infrastructure for residential and commercial development. Final slide. In terms of the lessons for integration, natural assets into business models. So I just wanted to really quickly suggest what I've called the 5 pointers for framing this journey as a problem to solution journey. So I think this is building on the things that came through for me at the Business Impact School. So key thing for me was language. It's really, really important that you kind of drop your nomenclature that suits a research setting and actually understand how to talk about the key things you're trying to convey in a business community in the right way so people actually understand what you're talking about. So rather than talking about costs, you talk about investment, really shaping the message to fit the needs of your delivery partners. If you want to innovate, then you have to bring people on that journey with you. In terms of multiple benefits, it's recognizing that there are different kinds of benefits, and you're asking different delivery agents to be interested at different stages of the journey. So immediate versus long term. In terms of who pays for the uplift in value, often in a development setting, you're asking for that capital investment up front, and actually the benefits that come back to society, public goods and services, are much longer term. So those wider benefits to society, creating a narrative that makes sense to the business community, those people who are paying for the new infrastructure, you have to find a way to make that message make sense to them. In terms of building confidence as well, I think this continues to be a really big theme for me. So often I go into a room, and when I work with developers every day, but they're often perceived by people in the third sector, charitable and environment sector as the bad guys. Are they bad guys, or are they agents of change that you just haven't engaged with yet? So businesses, I believe, are really trying to understand all the risks and opportunities associated with protecting and enhancing the environment, and it's our job to actually help them do that better, more effectively, more consistently. Partnership and collaboration. So the more that academics and practitioners from the voluntary sector can help them do that,
then we got a win-win situation from that. So it's really important to kind of enter a room in that spirit of goodwill, partnership and collaboration, rather than I'm here to tell you what the answer is and what you're doing wrong at the moment. I think it's that two-way all the time. And then finally, in terms of defining key opportunities, so making sure that the opportunities are framed in a way that businesses can understand. So lots of talk at the moment about biodiversity net gain. How do you frame that in a way that actually prioritises and highlights the benefits for everyone? So it's not just a compliance issue, but actually there's a chance here for real innovation. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
You've probably noticed, and I'm at fault here, that our opening plenary was rather old, grey and distinctly male. And we're now getting a new generation through with some leading young women who are probably our hope for the future. So I'm glad we're slightly redressing the balance in this session. Having said that, next up we have Colm. We have Colm Bowe from Liverpool John University, one of our placements, who is hosted by Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which of course works very closely with businesses around these kinds of issues. So over to you, Colm.
Hi everybody. As Guy said, so I'm a senior lecturer at Liverpool John University, but as I also mentioned before, I'm chair of the Liverpool City Region Natural Capital Working Group, and I'm also currently leading on an Elms project as well. So hopefully I'm one of those academics that are still in academia that are bridging back the other way into wider society. So as Guy said, I've been asked to talk about my placement that was with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. That was a placement I did back in 2017. And essentially, the aim of that placement was to work with the businesses within the natural capital impact group of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And what we were doing was we were talking about with them. So remember, this is back in 2017, before we had the 25-year plan and before we had Elms or the agricultural bill released. So we were talking to them about getting their views on how natural capital might look within post-Brexit agricultural policy. So what I'm going to do today is present some of the results from that, but also talk to you guys how it's kind of formed my thinking around business and natural capital, but particularly around private investment coming from business into natural capital within rural areas. So as already been pointed out today, we now know that we've got the agricultural bill, and with the agricultural bill, we've got the environmental land management system. So we know that government's going to put some public money into public goods that will be paid to farmers and other land owners. But what we don't, and we're assuming that some of those public goods will include natural capital. But what we don't know is how much money is going to come through, and how much that might be compared to CAP. Whether that's farmers are going to have less money available to them, and is that going to be enough money to achieve some of the goals that we've set out within the 25-year environment plan? So we already know about one source of funding that's going to come from the private sector, and that's the mandatory investment that's going to be driven by mandatory net gain. But then there's the other aspect of businesses investing for business return, and we know that there are some examples of that out there, but those are still quite rare. So the examples that Nestle paying farmers to improve the resilience within their supply chains, lots of discussion and work through things like the Lens projects, looking at water companies investing in both water quality and water quantity, and then there's various discussions around infrastructure and insurance companies also investing. But one of the questions is but at the moment these examples are still quite rare, and from the businesses that we spoke to within the Cambridge group, there was some variation in terms of the likely levels of investment that business thought would potentially happen. So I guess the question then lies is how large a role we expect business to play beyond that investment that's driven by the regulatory sector. On top of that, we then have the other effects of Brexit. So the other thing we did was take the interviews that we did with the businesses and use that as a steer to develop a number of scenarios around what post-Brexit agricultural policy might look like and the impacts of what that might be. And so depending on, obviously we now know Brexit's happening, but depending on the trade outcome and the level of payments that farmers receive, that's going to have a number of different effects. And I won't go into those in detail because you can read our report to find out more about those. But essentially there are 4 main outcomes that may happen. So a decline within the agricultural sector, a need for the farmers to increase farm performance and productivity, potentially both of the above, depending on where you are as a farmer and what sort of farmer you are, or potentially little change. If we are likely to see a decline within the agricultural sector, then we might want to look at investment within natural capital around things like carbon, water quality, flood control, and driving the tourist industry to try and promote growth within the rural economies and rural sectors. If we see a potential need for an increase in farm performance, we want farmers to carry out that improvement within their farm performance or production, but do that in a sustainable way. So we might want to invest around natural capital to do that, so around soil quality, improving soil quality and things like that. So the question that kind of our research posed was that can we achieve that through just the environmental land management system, so through the public money and through the private money that's driven by legislation, or what is the role of private investment in this? So if we think about a number of those ecosystem services that I've highlighted, those are highly relevant to a number of business sectors in terms of agribusiness, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of tourism. So if we want business to start investing within natural capital, then how do we start to encourage them to do that? So again, this is one of the things we talk to the businesses about, and the businesses highlighted that investment will be driven by return. And there's increasing academic literature that talks about being green, being better for the bottom line. But it's not as simple as potentially businesses investing in some types of natural capital and the public sector investing in other types of natural capital. It's very difficult to disentangle the different beneficiaries that you get from ecosystem services and natural capital, and so it's going to be potentially more complicated than that. And also what return looks like for different businesses may look slightly different. The other question is then should we start establishing legislative frameworks to help support private investment? So that might help to mediate and support the interactions between the businesses and the landowner. And there's been a certain amount of writing that's been done on that by people like Green Alliance and the Aldersgate Group. And that, again, reflected back on what the businesses told us. The businesses highlighted that co-investors and delivery partners are going to be really important to be able to implement this. The other question that we started to think about was, should government incentivise? And we've looked at some of those already today, and things like green bonds has already come up. And the businesses we talked to indicated that, yes, it would be beneficial to do that, to at least kickstart the market. These markets are still quite immature, and things like this could help to drive that forward. There's potentially lessons we can learn from social value investment and the way government has supported that sector as well. And then there's another aspect in terms of natural capital accounting and reporting. So the businesses we spoke to indicated that they were keen to set natural capital goal outcomes alongside government. And there's that question of how mandatory do we want natural capital accounting to become. So there's already some movement towards that in terms of the carbon sector, but how we might expand that and how business might interact with us within that journey. And then the last point I wanted to make, the last point that kind of came out of our work was this issue around free riding. So free riding is essentially the issue you get is if you get one business investing, but because we're dealing largely with public goods, then other businesses can then benefit from that without investing themselves. There's also the issue of businesses potentially free riding on public investment as well. So for me, this is one of the key issues that we need to resolve if we're going to get a healthy sector being created in terms of private investment within natural capital beyond the large progressive organisations that are doing it now. They're interacting with things like the Lens Project. We're going to start getting SMEs and small businesses starting to think about this, and we need to think about that free riding issue to try and resolve that. Yeah, thanks very much.
Many thanks, Colm. So we're going to move on to 3 rapid presentations on our synthesis reports coming out of the programme. So first we have Victoria Janes-Bassett from the Benton Centre for Sustainability in Business at Lancaster University on soil natural capital valuation needs for agribusiness. Victoria.
So hi everyone, thanks for having me here today. I'm just going to give a brief overview of our synthesis report on soil natural capital valuation for agribusiness, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Lancaster University working with Jess Davies. So this was a short project back in 2018, and I wanted to thank the Value in Nature programme for providing funding for this work. And we worked in partnership with an international agri-food business called Olam, who operate from seed to shelf in a range of products, particularly cocoa, coffee, nuts and spices. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So first of all, soils are valuable. They provide a whole range of ecosystem services across food provision, but also water regulation and quality, and climate regulation and biodiversity support. And various studies have tried to quantify the value of soil-derived ecosystem services. And I don't want you to take too much away from these values rather than just pointing out that the soils are valuable. These values have a large uncertainty and they're largely variable between space and place. Despite their value, though, soils are degrading. Around a third of our soils globally are classified as moderately or severely degraded, and that area increases at an alarming rate every year. We're seeing issues such as erosion, compaction, salt issues, and ultimately desertification. And the issues surrounding soil degradation is that when soils degrade, they don't provide ecosystem services in the same way, and we lose these benefits. And soil degradation issues are estimated to cost us society a significant amount of money every year. So looking at agribusinesses, particularly companies like Olam, soils underpin their business model. They're a fundamental part of the supply chain. And so we worked with Olam to evaluate, in this project we evaluate existing frameworks for natural capital valuation, discussed with Olam needs for valuation of natural capital frameworks within their business, and then looked at the sort of how those existing frameworks met their needs. And we identified sort of 5 key areas where businesses such as Olam could benefit from natural capital valuation methods. The first thing is identifying business risk and resilience. So as I said, soils underpin agribusinesses, but also other businesses. And so natural capital provides a means for identifying dependencies within the supply chain for businesses. It can reduce costs, not just so operating costs. So whilst sustainable management can not just whilst promoting investment in natural capital assets, it can reduce operating costs for the business, provide an increased product value, particularly in a society now as we've been hearing about increased awareness of environmental concerns, and consumers value those sustainable practices. Co-benefits, so these ecosystem services have both private value to the business, but also public benefits, and identifying those public benefits can also have private value to the business. And then in terms of corporate and social responsibilities, businesses have sort of a responsibility to look after the environment. So ultimately, natural capital is key to the long-term sustainable business models for these agribusinesses. So as I said, working with Olam, we identified 3 key areas or requirements from a natural capital framework. The first one, as I said, is understanding risk, so understanding the dependencies of the business on natural capital assets. And a key way to do this is to understand what we've termed the whole pathway of natural capital and ecosystem service provision. So what I mean is, whilst we're looking at the benefits and ecosystem services from which they're derived and the natural capital stocks, but also understanding how those natural capital stocks can change as a result of changing drivers, management and supporting processes. Building a strong business case. So obviously in an agri-food setting, one of the primary considerations is crop productivity, but to build a strong business case, if we consider a multiple range of soil ecosystem services and benefits, particularly across carbon sequestration and climate regulation and water regulation, this can help promote a change in practice. And differentiating between benefits, so as I said about those with private and public value, and acknowledging that those with public benefits can have private value to the business. And then finally, we just identified evidence gaps, as we've been hearing about, and whilst we appreciate there are evidence gaps, we do have enough scientific evidence and tools to be able to make a start of understanding of how to quantify natural capital in soils. But we do need to consider this wide range of soil ecosystem services rather than focusing individually on specifically food productivity. And we need to understand this dynamic representation of natural capital stocks and how they can change over time. And ultimately, mechanisms that allow, as we've been hearing, closer partnership between business and science, and mechanisms that allow this kind of co-creation of science. And our report is available on the Valuing Nature website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. And I know we've got a number of food supply chain companies and land-owning companies in the room, so I'm sure that's of interest to you in particular. We'll have next Emma Rothero, who is from Sheffield Institute for International Development, and her synthesis report is on the natural capital of floodplains as a function of land use. So very pertinent at this time of immense flooding in the UK. Emma.
Thank you. Yes, hi. My name is Emma Rothero. I'm the project manager for a partnership organisation called the Floodplain Meadows Partnership. We're hosted at the Open University, and we are a group of academics and conservation practitioners, farmers and other research organisations who all have a very specific interest in species-rich ancient floodplain meadows. We were fortunate enough to secure this grant from the Valuing Nature programme, which gave us an amount of money to undertake a literature review on the natural capital of floodplains and in the context of land uses. This literature review showed us that 70% of English and Welsh floodplains are in some form of intensive agriculture, and that's a mix of either improved grassland or arable and horticulture, as compared to only 11% of our floodplains that are in some form of semi-natural habitat land use, covered by fen, marsh, swamp, neutral grasslands or broadleaved woodlands. 42% of our rivers are no longer in connection to our floodplains through over-deepening, development and flood alleviation schemes. We went on to look at these figures in the context of what ecosystem services those land uses delivered using the terminology in the National Ecosystem Assessment. This graph shows the figures for English floodplains only. So you can see the 70% of improved grassland and arable and horticulture land use. And those land uses that cover the most floodplain areas deliver the fewest number of ecosystem services compared to those land uses that have the smallest area of coverage in English floodplains, which deliver the largest number of services. And this is a mismatch in our view in terms of what society could benefit from changes in land use in floodplains. Our interest particularly is in the neutral grassland little pie at the bottom, which is where floodplain meadows sit. But this literature review also looked at woodlands, fens, marshes and swamps. As part of this review, we found this very interesting case study that the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust had undertaken in 2017. They wanted to look at the costed service provision of a nature reserve that they've owned for 30 years before and after restoration from an intensive arable farm to an extensive agricultural nature reserve. This is a nature reserve in the Thames Valley. They bought it in the 1980s and they converted it from all the arable land went over into lowland meadow, floodplain meadow. They added in some wetland habitats and did some tree planting and hedge planting as part of the conversion into a nature reserve. And in 2017, they employed some consultants to look at costing ecosystem service provision. And this is what they found. After 30 years, if they had stayed as an arable farm and a commercial system, they would have seen £1.2 million worth of ecosystem service benefits, as compared to £8.2 million worth of ecosystem service benefits as it existed under a nature reserve scenario. And the figures are taken from various sources in the literature that the company that undertook this consultancy work had found, and they're reasonably widely used as far as I can tell. But you can see the big gains in water regulation, climate regulation, that came from converting the arable to lowland meadow. natural flood management, wildlife gains, and outdoor recreation and health benefits. The farm is still managed as a productive system because it's managed as a meadow, but it doesn't have as much production as it does under an arable farm. And I think this is a really interesting study to show what could happen if we converted more of our arable floodplains into these kind of lower intensive land uses in floodplains. As part of our literature review, specifically looking at soil carbon, we found some figures to show what these different land uses could store in terms of carbon. And you can see, obviously, the values range, but you've got arable and horticultural at the bottom. We have some unpublished data, which we're currently bringing together, which specifically looks at floodplain meadows in the UK, which shows that their carbon storage is very significantly greater than many of the other land uses in floodplains. And this is because they're very ancient systems, so you've got a very deep profile. Species-rich systems store more carbon than species-poor ones. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to fly the flag for grasslands in the carbon discussion that's going on at the moment. Everybody talks about trees and peatlands as well. And Mark Reed mentioned grassland, not a grassland carbon code. He mentioned the peatland carbon code, and there's a woodland carbon code, but I don't think there's a grassland carbon code, and there really ought to be, because these are very important carbon storage systems. Finally, we would really like to work with the business community on developing this area of research. We'd like to look at the effectiveness of floodplain restoration in reducing flood risk and maximising carbon storage. We would like to work with the insurance industry to look at evidence and data that would help in floodplain insurance systems. We would obviously like to research more the complex ecological and biogeochemical processes in floodplains, which is one of the reasons why there are multiple benefits to be gained from semi-natural and natural floodplain systems. And we would also like to look more at valuing species-rich habitats, and in particular, species-rich grasslands. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And what we heard from DEFRA this morning about public payment for public goods coming down the line, I'm sure many lowland farmers might be interested in the wealth of ecosystem services that might be valid for receipt of such public payments in lowland flood meadows. We now have a video, one more video, this time from Rose Pritchard of Sheffield Institute for International Development, on early adoption of natural capital in the private sector. So this was another of the Valuing Nature synthesis reports. So could you kindly start that for us, please?
And I'm going to give a very quick overview of a report I put together with Dan van der Horst at the University of Edinburgh in 2018 for the Valuing Nature Network, where we reviewed the current status of natural capital assessment among private sector organisations. So private sector engagement with natural capital approaches is still quite a new thing, as I'm sure you're all very much aware. And our interest was in businesses who were early adopters of natural capital accounting, also including those businesses who'd engaged with adjacent approaches like environmental profit and loss assessments. We were interested in why businesses were picking up these approaches, which types of businesses were early adopters of the approach, and what kinds of impacts were being observed as a result of using these approaches. For this latter question, we were interested in benefits to business, but also in some of the bigger claims, often made around natural capital assessment, that there will also be benefits emerging for environment and for society. So to answer these questions, we reviewed publicly available case study material from early adopting businesses, both written by businesses themselves, for example, as part of corporate sustainability reports, and also secondary materials from groups like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Now, we're very aware that this literature is a partial sample, because we know that there is material which has been produced which isn't publicly available. So we present these very much as preliminary findings. Our objective here is hopefully to inspire more research, as opposed to pretending that we've already figured out the totality of the story, the totality of what's going on here. In terms of the who, what we found was a skew towards large multinationals headquartered in Europe and North America, and towards businesses in the materials sector. In terms of the why, we find a lot of the reasons you would expect. For example, better understanding of natural capital impacts and dependencies, better understanding of natural capital risks to enable strategic planning. But also important was that we saw lots of narratives around innovation and around the reputational benefits of adopting a pioneering approach. And this does inevitably raise a question about whether the early popularity of the approach is going to persist when this shine is worn off, and how you can maintain this initial appeal for longer-term impact. And this leads on to that question about impacts, which is, of course, one of the themes of this session. The primary impacts we saw reported by businesses at this stage were reputational, and there were also benefits reported for communication within companies and with wider stakeholder networks. And those are all really good, really worthwhile things, particularly the communication benefits of this as a tool. But what we didn't see just yet was evidence of meaningful behaviour changes towards increased sustainability. And there are potentially really good explanations for this. Firstly, that the approach is still in its early stages and might need a bit more time to mature. It's also totally plausible that changes are happening but haven't been shared because there is no requirement for external disclosure. You've also got a classic counterfactual problem where you don't know what would have happened without the use of the natural capital approach. But my feeling is that if this approach is to enable building of bridges across boundaries and beyond those who are already convinced by natural capital concepts, natural capital approaches, there is a need for proofs of concept and for illustrations that really substantial changes are occurring as a result of the adoption of natural capital valuations. So those were our findings. We have looked at things quite critically. It is a critical analysis, but our objective by doing so is to be constructive and to facilitate, hopefully, improvements in the approach. I would really welcome any feedback, particularly any examples of impact case studies or success stories which we might have missed. We'd really value anything which might refute the idea that there haven't been major impacts that we didn't capture in our initial analysis. So if there's anything that you would like to share, it would be great if you could get in touch with me using the email address on the slide. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to contribute today.
So many thanks to Rose for that. I'm sure there may be some businesses in the room who'd like to refute some of her critical findings, so please do get in touch with her. We'll now final presentation is from Eche. Eche, a colleague on the programme coordination team who's been the instigator and lead on many of our demystifying papers. So Eche, over to you.
Thank you, Guy. I consider myself extremely lucky for having the opportunity to work in Wellbeing Nature programme. I must have internalized it so much that I have forgotten to put my name on the slide. One thing that was particularly important and exciting about Wellbeing Nature programme for me was that it is a genuinely interdisciplinary effort in everything that we did, from programmes to events and publications. And one thing that you realise, that it is a very exciting to work in an interdisciplinary research. It's great fun, but it's also riddled with information asymmetry. Most of us are experts in one thing, and we know pretty little or nothing in everything else. And we become quite pessimistic on a day-to-day basis, that we think not only that we don't know anything about the other topics, but nothing is known about them. And I think our objective has been in the program to dispel that a lot of work goes on, a lot of data there is, a lot of evidence there is, and the morning's keynote speakers were very encouraging that we need to just get on with what we know. And the demystifying papers came about to help with the language barriers, really, because we don't mix enough across disciplines, across sectors. We don't even mix enough across the departments of a given organization. And when we do, we have difficulty understanding each other because we use different words, different numbers, or we use the same words and same numbers, but to mean different things, and it might take us months to figure out that we were talking in cross purposes the whole time. So Demystifying series started because we all had lots of the same questions that we had to answer over and over again, and we didn't have a go-to document. There were lots of documents in all these topics that you'll see, but they weren't written by the community. And by community, I mean the community of the Wellbeing Nature programme. And network is that research providers and also research users coming together to write something. And we also wanted to make these series accessible So accessible language, not jargon, where there is terminology we need to know about each other's work. We have glossaries in there, and not necessarily the final word on the subject, but definitely the first authoritative word. All of these are also printed, perhaps a little old-fashioned, but people who read them said it's also useful to have something physical you can plonk on someone's desk and say, read this, before you speak to me next time. And these have been very popular documents, I'm pleased to say. These three are particularly useful for the business management context. Economic valuation one, I think, printed and downloaded about 5,000 times. It's the most popular thing I've been involved in. And there are other ones on health, on shared and social values, arts and arts research, and I think a comic book is coming as part of not necessarily the Demystifying series, but Demystifying things. And who knew there were many definitions of health? We don't have many health professionals here, but lots of areas are crying out for this kind of demystifying papers to be written, and they're great fun to do. I hope it'll be one of the legacies of the program. So let me tell you briefly about the three. The economic valuation was, if you know me, not surprising, this was the first one I started. I do economic valuation of environment, natural capital assets, etc. And I thought when I first started this, there'll be 10 of my friends who would survive through the process. 120 people joined and 118 survived. So it's a great, great way of bringing the community together, because you have a product at the end and then they go out and spread the word. So I really recommend the experience. The reason why this is important for business is that it's all beyond carbon. And when we want to make business cases for business involvement and investment, we need to compare all these wonderful environmental benefits to financial costs and financial opportunity costs. So we need to talk the language of money, however incomplete and however insensitive it can be. It's a language that's worth learning, and this document gives the basics. The next one was on cost-benefit analysis. All economists and policy analysts in public sector has to read something, or I hope they do, something called the Treasury's Green Book. It tells you about how public sector business cases and appraisals are done, should be done, and tells you a little bit about how to broaden your inclusion of costs and benefits beyond a single organization, but for the benefit of the whole society. So this demystifying paper is an introduction to Green Book, if you like. This one was written by a particular expert, Martin Hurst, and also with input from the Treasury, people who work on the Green Book. Again, it's useful to understand the language if we want to do more public-private finance initiatives. We need to understand what principles we're working with. Finally, it's green finance. Demystifying green finance is the final in the series, and it's not a typo that the finance is big in the title. It's because this demystifying paper is more about understanding what finance is about to the environmental community, whether they're in academia, business, or policy. A lot of terminology in green finance. A lot of it means different things. But we have to get a handle on to be able to screen out the terms that we don't want to use in the future. So this document, again, with about 40 participation from finance sector as well as environmental sector, operating at many levels and many sectors, trying to get through that fog and find the terms that would help. Understand the drivers of what's pushing for green finance, why our businesses and finance houses are interested, but what barriers there are, so what campaigns do we need to do going forward to make green finance beyond carbon again. There are a lot of examples, and I think what's left next is to write a demystifying paper on the green bit of green finance for the finance and business professionals. And if you're interested, I'm here all day. But now you got lunch, I think, right? Or maybe Peter? No, okay. Thank you.
Many thanks, Addison. So that brings our whirlwind tour of business relevance of activity under the Valuing Nature programme to an end. I'm sorry to impinge on your lunch hour a little bit here. We're almost finished. I'll just hand over. Peter, do you want to say a few sort of wrap up? No, you're going to let people off. That's very nice of you. That's very nice of you. So we've concluded our retrospective. The afternoon is all about forward-looking and the emerging natural assets research and innovation agenda in support of business. Please reconvene, if you don't mind, at 1:30 sharp. It gives you almost 50 minutes to enjoy your lunch. And we'll introduce this emerging agenda in session 3, and then we'll move straight into a breakout where you have your chance to make input and validation around this emerging agenda, and then we'll have a final wrap-up. We do aim to finish by 4:15 as per programme, and hope many of you will then want to stay on for drinks after. So please do enjoy your lunch and reconvene here in this room 1:30 sharp. Thank you.